Hi, this is Roger Green, host of the Surfing the MASH Tsunami podcast. This week, we are offering 5 conversations from episode 23, our discussion on challenges in physician-patient communication stemming from a session at the EASL Congress, with Louise Campbell, session co-chairs Shira Zelber-Sagi and Mike Patel, and panelists Jose Willemse and Tom Margeau. Plus, from the vault, a discussion from Shira's previous appearance on Surfing MASH in the U.S. Thanksgiving 2022 special. This episode's a bit unusual for 2 reasons. First, I'm not part of the conversation. Louise leads it brilliantly in my absence. Second, it focuses far more on the patient and the role of the physician-patient interaction in steering treatment. I found this fascinating and hope you do as well. This week's vault comes from our first episode with Shira Zelber-Sagi. She and Ken Cusi joined us during Thanksgiving week in the U.S. 2022 to discuss nutrition and behavioral issues related to MASLD. The episode's introduction is pretty robust, so I'll let my 2022 voice take over from here. Hi, this is Roger Green, host of the Surfing the MASH Tsunami podcast. This weekend, we are offering 4 conversations from Season 3, Episode 39, our look at early diagnosis models, plus, from the vault, a 2021 conversation that sheds light on similar issues. As we've all heard on this podcast over the years, late diagnosis costs money and haunts patients who live with the severe downstream consequences of a disease that became more severe while physicians assured them that it was not an issue and did not need to be treated until it was late. This model provides insight into steps that might bring earlier treatment to the patients who need it at a socially acceptable cost. So sit back, listen, enjoy, learn. And when you're done, join the dialogue on our LinkedIn discussion group. This conversation, part of our series of going back to our friends, patients, and patient advocates and asking about the big stories this summer, is with Tony Vigliotti from NASH Knowledge. Tony, how are you today?
I'm doing fine, Roger. Thank you.
Okay. So Tony and I were commiserating in that we live at different ends of the state of Pennsylvania, which is kind of a mid-sized state by U.S. standards for those of you who are not in the U.S. Our areas were both damaged by the flooding that resulted from the hurricane this week. But fortunately, we both emerged pretty much intact despite having seen problems a mile or 2 from where we lived. Tony, any residual damage there today, or is it all over in Pittsburgh?
No, it seems to be all over. I'm sure there are people still cleaning out their basements and so forth, but for the bulk of us, it's kind of yesterday's news at this stage.
It took me 4 different passes of roads to find a clear path to the place where I'm working from today. So it's not on this side of the state. There's still a bunch going on. At any rate, so Tony, the subject that you wanted to talk about today, I guess, were a couple of major studies around prevalence and awareness within the U.S. population. Let me, and I tried to mention this yet. We have Louise with us for this conversation as well. Hey, Louise, how are you?
Good evening. I'm fine, thank you.
Looks bright and sunny where you are.
It is very bright and sunny where I am, so that's going to be a good sign for the weekend, I hope.
And that's a window look I've not seen before that I'm aware of. Where are you exactly right now?
I'm in the Campbell, which is a marina down on the south coast by Portsmouth. So very nice location.
So are you on a boat?
I am on a boat, yeah.
That's what I was going to say. It looks like you're on a boat.
It is. It's quite a pleasant way to spend a weekend for my birthday.
When is your birthday?
It's tomorrow, so this is the last bit of work I'm doing before I hit another year milestone.
Well, happy birthday. And
thank you.
32 looks good on you, Louise.
Yeah, 32 again.
Okay, with that, let's turn to Tony. Tony, floor is yours. Share with us what you think we should be discussing today.
Yeah, the 2 things, my background is to be very analytic about things and number-oriented. And while we talk about the prevalence of NASH and NAFLD, there were 2 articles that came out recently that really caught my attention and struck me as being very important as evidence to what I've long believed, that there is a lack of awareness of this whole situation. The first article was a prospective evaluation of the prevalence of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and steatohepatitis in a large middle-aged U.S. cohort. That was a study done by Stephen Harrison and some of his associates. The second article was one that was published in Hepatology Communications that was titled Poor Awareness of Liver Disease Among Adults with NAFLD in the United States. And the articles pretty much reach similar conclusions and present the same evidence, and that is that in the first article, prospective evaluation, of the people they studied, which was a middle-aged cohort of adults in Texas, I believe, that about 38% of those have NAFLD, and about 14% have NASH. You have to allow for the fact that it's middle-aged, doesn't include all age groups, but that's at least consistent and maybe higher than what we had been led to believe. Particularly the NASH component. Typically hear numbers like 20 to 25% of the people with NAFLD have NASH. In this case, more than a third of the people with NAFLD had NASH. So that was the first article. The second article, my biggest takeaway from that article was how many people that have NAFLD don't know they have it. And overall, the population they studied showed that only about 6% of the people that have NAFLD know that they have it. And that varied somewhat by age group. The younger age group they studied, these were adults. The younger age group, people in their 20s had no awareness that they had NAFLD, but it didn't get any greater than, I think, 8% or so, even in the older age group. So those two together, in my mind, were kind of a 1-2 punch, that really appealed to someone like me who is focused on this lack of awareness. Just because I think the more you can convey through evidence of this lack of awareness, the further along we're going to be.
Tony, thanks for that. That's a great summary of those two papers. One of the things that struck me that you didn't mention, but I think is interesting, is that the 38% number in the Harrison paper, the number in the other paper, which came out of NHANES, the NHANES population database, which is huge and widely used, was, I think, a shade under 37, maybe 36.8%. So the numbers that I think you hear bandied about are the 25% of the population has NAFLD and 25% of those have NASH. Well, both of these papers suggest that number 25 might be low by as much as 50%. And as you point out correctly, Stephen's paper suggests that a third of those have NASH. And as you also point out, in the NHANES study, virtually nobody knew it.
Exactly.
And the other point about the Harrison paper is that all those folks were being evaluated for normal colon cancer screen, and then asked if they wanted to get information about their liver while they were in there. So in that population, nobody knew they had liver disease. The commonality of those two data sets really struck me, given how different the sources that they came from was.
I felt the same, Roger. I mean, I'm an eager reader of the studies like this, and I just found it extremely interesting that it shows that, that maybe we're understating the problem, not overstating it.
Mm-hmm. So, Louise, I'm not familiar with any similar literature done outside the U.S. Are you familiar? Just asking, are you familiar with any studies like that done other places in the world?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head, and to be fair, if there was going to be one, it would be Jeff Lazarus or Jörn, someone like that, to do an epidemiology. And I know they've done a large European review, but whether or not that went into sort of the intent numbers, I think we're all familiar with just quoting 1 in 4 of the global population have it. What do we base that on? I'm not 100% familiar with exactly where that data comes from, but I know Zabir Younossi has used those figures, and he seems to be one of the certainly the gurus of the epidemiology and that endpoint. If we start looking in bespoke populations like Stephen's, it does appear to be higher. If I look in the populations that I've looked at, it does appear to be higher in people who just present lack of knowledge, lack of awareness, and I think Tony's absolutely correct. It's this lack of awareness that is going to lead to the continued avoidance and ignorance of something that's potentially so damaging.
So watching the two of you talk to each other about this is a little bit like watching the choir master and the preacher at the same time. But I'm going to encourage that anyway. It's kind of hard to tease these apart. But one challenge conveyed by those numbers is making people more aware that they need to be tested. A second challenge is making healthcare professionals more aware that they need to test. And then a third is to make sure that if that testing yields greater knowledge, as we expect it would, that gets translated into some kind of call for action. Which of the first two do you think will be a bigger challenge? Or how would you, let's not do that, how would you tackle the first two? Or how do you suggest that we do that, the making people aware that this is more prevalent than they think, and by the way, that they need to get tested?
Well, that is a challenge. And we formed NASH Knowledge 3 years ago. That's what we undertook as our mission, to try to make more people aware of this disease. And it is difficult. When you engage with people about their liver, their thought immediately turns to alcohol. And, I'm not a drinker. I don't need to worry about that. So that's a difficult hurdle to overcome. That's where we spend, while we do some things aimed at existing liver patients, we try to spend most of our time addressing people who we think may be at risk for the disease, and just the general public, people who someday may be at risk. And as you said, one of the issues is that even in the medical profession, there is a general lack of awareness that I've certainly encountered. And talking to people in our support group, for example, they've encountered when they were first told they had a fatty liver. So it's tough. I mean, we try to use social media, and we're trying to ramp up our efforts on that front, and just getting out there. COVID is, initially we try to go out to public events and just engage people one-on-one about the problem and hope they would tell their friends and so forth. But with COVID, obviously, there's been a lot of restrictions on those kind of activities. You would like to get out there more and do things like that. And I know here in Pittsburgh, there's something called the Pittsburgh Diabetes Club that has an annual meeting, and I've been invited to be an exhibitor this fall at their meeting, and I think that's an opportunity to engage professionals and endocrinologists who I will try to reinforce with them the need to screen their patients or talk to their patients about liver disease. It's a tough task. If it was easy, I guess people would know about it.
Yeah, that sounds right. So, Louise, how is life different over there on this issue, if so?
I don't think it's any different. I think Tony described it really well. I think it is a genuine lack of knowledge throughout, whether it's from primary care, through medicine. And Tony and his team have spent a lot of time looking at education, and I think we do have to rewrite information, and we have to rewrite knowledge, but we have to write it from a young age. So children need to grow up knowing that the liver is an important aspect to how they manage their lifestyle and their body. If you're taught to and learn how to look after your body, you're more likely to do so as you go on, because it becomes second nature. Also, your parents need to know about that. When we're looking at Stephen's study and the other study, these are educated people who still have no awareness of a condition that is affecting them. Stephen's study particularly, that 38%. Yet these people were involved in healthcare, in a paradigm in healthcare that was being given to them by medical people, and they still had a lack of awareness. So if they have a lack of awareness, anything they're feeding their children, anything they're doing within their lifestyle actually conveys that continued ignorance. And it's not a desire to be ignorant, it's the fact that we just haven't focused on it. As I've said before on the podcast, we can come out of education knowing more about how to shape a lump of wood than we know how to look after our bodies, which are there for lifestyle. If we look after our bodies from a very early age, if we teach people that actually could reduce healthcare costs over time. Now, I know people will be saying, but we want the evidence of that first. Well, the obesity crisis has grown at such a fast rate that do we actually need to sit here and wait for the evidence to come out on that? Or can we assume by what we're seeing, and we've already evidence-based in cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, bariatric surgery, liver disease, and I can go on, or do we actually take a punt and try and stop some of this occurring? Because those children who have fatty liver disease are being fed by parents who don't have the information to change it, except lose weight, exercise more, which we know doesn't work in a lot of people. Stephen and Arun did a very good summary of why that doesn't work. So I think it does have to start young. It has to start with the education, because if people drive their own wellness, you can then come to a pass where healthcare only intervenes when there's a healthcare issue. The majority of people have poor liver health. They don't have liver disease. By finding and addressing poor liver health, we can prevent liver disease, but we'll also find the liver disease that's present to be able to reverse and treat. I said the other day on the session is actually, if in doubt, rule the liver out. Do not rule it in. Assume that it's got a component in any disease that you're looking at, whether it's methotrexate use for rheumatology, rule it out. Rule that there's no damage to the liver in that person, and then move on to the next one. So I suppose for me it's a double whammy. We've got to go from medicine, and we've got to say that in all of its common diseases, let's rule it out. And from an education perspective, let's bring it into the curriculum for education very young. Then people aren't so stigmatised by it. They learn about it and how clever an organ it is. It's like the planets and the solar system. You can really engage in what this organ does at a very early age. So it is education, education, education. That could be the most cost-effective solution in any country, rich, poor, middle income, low income, middle of nowhere, if you look after your liver health a little bit better. But for me, it comes down to education.
Yeah, Louise, you're really preaching to the choir here. With me. That's a big focus of ours. We have developed some lesson plans to be implemented into schools' curriculums to as a starting point for this kind of thing. And we have three school districts lined up to test as a trial run. But again, COVID got in the way, and we've been delayed in that. But we think that's where it needs to start. If the kids grow up understanding how important their liver is and how to keep it healthy, the parents will know about it. Uncle Jody and Sue will hear about it, and so will Grandma and Grandpa. So that's really where we think our efforts need to be headed.
I also read recently, I was looking at, there was an NHS report about trying to add something into the school curriculum, and it was the fact that you just needed a minimum of something like 8 minutes extra exercise in primary school children to try and address the calories, and you can do that between classes. You could do that to stimulate them at the beginning of a class. 30 seconds in each class, a minute in each class, concentration goes up. All of the evidence that comes with. So there are simple ways to help increase exercise as well in school, and we should be focusing on that as well.
All good. Okay. I'm thinking about the demography and the epidemiology of all that, right? If right now we have 38% of the U.S. population done two different ways with NAFLD, and low teens, 1 out of 3 of those may be NASH, and maybe 1 out of 2 or 1 out of 3 of those with NASH have at least F2 or F3. If we could resolve this problem through education in a 10 to 15 year window, get those numbers way down, the cadre of people with a problem now would still kind of feel like a pig going through Python, I think. A big bubble all the way through. Is the process by which you educate the people who already have disease to get themselves tested or treated, and then how to resolve or ameliorate their disease or lessen it? Is that, do you envision as being the same education process we're talking about in the schools, or is it a completely different thing, or how would the schools play into that, do you think?
I think it's a different thing in that I think the vehicle through which you would be delivering the education just by necessity will have to be different. And that's a tougher sell in that with the school system, it's easy to go into that population once you are able to gain entry. Whereas the adult population of people who already have the disease, they're scattered all over the place. So how do you bring the message to them? And that's the real challenge. Hopefully, ultimately, there's more recognition of the problem in the media, and people just get hammered home. Every time you turn around, you hear about the disease, and probably that's the most effective way to reach that diverse group of people.
I agree with Tony. From my own aspect, when you introduce liver health to people who've chosen to get a liver scan, they're really, really interested. Not one person has ever turned around and said, I really didn't want to know that. And every single person turns around and said, if they've got fat in the liver, what can I do about that? How can I change it? And they're absolutely motivated. And I think for men's health particularly, men really engage with something that's quite visual and gives them results, more so than the women, because men's health and addressing health in men don't talk about health as much as women. Men don't access healthcare, certainly in the UK, as common as women. There is a difference in how people respond to the information and how dynamic they want to be. Generally, I get the sense that certainly the men with higher liver fat struggle a little bit more. People in the moderate range of medium fat, they are actually really, really motivated to get that down. And everybody smiles when they know what their treat is or what they do that's wrong. They give it away. You don't need a lie detector. So it's a total different mental aspect, I suppose, as to why they're doing it. You're telling them something that they need to do something about, and they engage with it, rather than telling them they've got an illness. Some of them have got an illness, and they will go on and they will get treated and they will get assessed for that illness. But the same as most people with fatty liver disease get referred straight back to their primary care, but have taken a lot of healthcare time to get there. What we need is to get the right people to the right place and the right people at the right time. And I think that's why we've always focused on the F3s and F4s, because those are the ones, as we know, who've got the immediate risk in the next few years of mortality, but also they've often been longest in the system. So I think everybody's individual, but I think it's more or less a two-pronged. You've got to address the ones with the more severe illness now and also educate. So somewhere in the middle, you will have a reduction in the system. If you reduce what's coming and you treat what's here, then hopefully you will see that education and the detection increase. Because the whole argument in healthcare now is if we find it, we've got to treat it. And if we find it, it's going to overwhelm the healthcare systems. The trouble is what we are seeing is cirrhosis grow in hospitals in the UK by about 15 to 20% year on year. If that rate continues, there was a published piece last year that 1 in 10 people in a hospital bed in the NHS have a liver condition from alcohol. That's 1 in 10. We are overwhelming the NHS, but we're still not looking, we're still not screening, and we're still saying, we need more evidence. How much more evidence do we need? And COVID has just provided a real kick in the pants, to be fair, with the mortality that fatty liver disease confers in its association with all of the other big conditions. So I think we can't rule it out. And again, you've just got to assess the liver. And For me, I'm a woman, I do breast screening, cervical screening. What's killing more people? Is it fatty liver disease and its comorbid conditions, or is it the conditions that we're regularly screening for? You can debate that, but I think the mortality rate with cardiovascular disease and associated other conditions with diabetes, the mortality rate that we're not recording as fatty liver disease is very, very high, and yet we're still not screening universally for it, and it's easy to screen for. We do have things like FibroScan that can tell you your liver fat. We know that simple steatosis is not simple, and it's certainly not benign. So when do we turn around and say that we need the FIB4, we need ELF, we need all of those non-invasive technologies, but we need something that a patient can understand. So it's got to come from all directions at the moment. Otherwise, we are surfing the NASH tsunami.
Yeah, well, we are living the NASH tsunami, aren't we? And that's probably about to get a lot worse. So I guess the one other question I'd have for you for today is, what do we expect to change, if anything, in this scenario over the next couple of years? You know, you represent two impassioned sets of educators in two different places, and there are more impassioned educators. But it's a crazy world we're living in. What will it take, do you believe, for us to have success in doing a better job of getting this education out there? And how much better do you think we're going to be able to do over the next couple of years?
I've got to jump in before Tony, because I think he deserves to finish it off. If I had to be honest, I'm not too sure too much will change. All of the major players will continue to be impassioned, but until we actually take it seriously, I cannot see us changing the eat less, move more, just lose weight without assessing what's underneath the reason for losing weight and motivating people to lose weight and telling them why we're telling them to lose weight. We have an NHS strategy with over 6 million people downloading an app to lose weight without any education of what that weight does and that weight loss does to their body or their insides. We have no routine screening. We do an audit screen in a GP practice. The British Liver Trust do a fantastic Love Your Liver screener, which includes all sorts of liver disease. That's the sort of screen that everybody should be getting in primary care. You come in, you get your liver screen, your heart screen, everything. But I cannot see it realistically changing because it is so siloed and piecemealed. Unless endocrinology and cardiology, our two big players, really enter the discussion and start assessing, I really can't see much changing over the next 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that could happen that would help to drive the message home. One is, I think our good friends at the Global Liver Institute are leading efforts to elevate discussion of liver health through policy and legislation. That will help. I think a second thing that could potentially help is if the FDA ever approves a NASH drug, because I think that will result in more money being thrown at the problem. Right now, many of the companies that are looking to develop the medical solutions aren't spending, in my mind, enough money on awareness because they don't have anything to sell right now. So I think when there's a commercial reason to spend more money on raising awareness, that will help. And then the third thing I think would help is if there was some kind of a national figure or famous person that would have the disease, that will help as well. We keep searching for such a person, but the problem is there are people that have the disease, but they don't know it.
Yeah, number one. And number two is, I think this is where stigma really does play a role, which is if you had somebody who was not a drinker and who was a Hollywood celebrity, for example, who developed severe fatty liver disease, their agents and publicists would be telling them immediately, people are going to think you have a drinking problem. Do you want that?
Well, that's true.
That's a derivative stigma issue, but I think it's a real issue. So for what it's worth, Tony, I agree with that. I think getting a drug approved will make a huge difference. Now, it may not be the education that Louise would want most because it will focus more on knowing you have illness as compared to preventing while you're well. But for a starting point, I think anything that lifts the knowledge levels is a good thing. And then people need to be clever to understand how to translate that from hey, you might have an illness here to you don't have to have that illness if you did these things. Does that make sense to you guys, at least?
Oh, it makes perfect sense. The one thing that I would want to see, certainly in the UK, is that if you were a patient with liver disease admitted to any hospital, or certainly district general hospital, without a liver speciality, that you have the ability to get a gastro nurse specialist or a liver disease nurse specialist. In most hospitals, you just don't get access. But if you are admitted with diabetes, you get access to a diabetes nurse. If you're admitted with cardiovascular disease, you get a cardiovascular disease specialist. So we have very, very little parity at all to be able to help educate patients and to find them with the disease once they get there. And I'm sure Tony will agree that part of the biggest way to address your own condition is education. And it is that first teaching moment and how it's done and what it means to you that really is so vital. And if you don't have anybody in a hospital who can do that, you lose those moments. And it really, really makes it hard for us as liver specialists to treat people because nobody's been able to give them the education because they haven't had access to it.
I would certainly agree with that. One thing I might add, I had a recent discussion with a pharmaceutical company, and what we discussed was, when a drug does get approved, it won't be a matter that you can sit on your couch and eat pizza and drink sugary beverages and you're cured. It's going to have to be done in association with other actions that you take. I think that may help on the awareness front because there will be some emphasis, hopefully, on kind of the corollary actions that you will need to take in addition to taking a drug.
Yeah, so one thought that goes along with that is that there are three legs to the stool of urgency about treating cardiovascular diabetes, one of which is we know exactly how they harm. The second is that we have tools where we can track progress, right? Day-to-day behavioral progress, right? You can track cholesterol every week. You can track blood sugar a couple times a day, glycohemoglobin as often as you want to do blood tests. And then the third is you have drugs that you can treat with. We're kind of 0 for 3 here. So the nice thing about the ELF approval is that while it's not for the purpose we'd care about most, it is the first time that that could be an easily accessible, non-invasive test is approved to have a significant level of predictive value or prognostic value, right? So ultimately, the hope is that this generation of liquid biopsies, liquid tests, will be able to meet that need for a way to test weekly, monthly, quarterly, to see whether you're making sustained progress. That's more complicated with the liver because livers heal on their own in some cases, but nonetheless, that would be step number one. And if you've got that and you have the drug piece, then in fact, I think the rest of it will follow because now we can tell people they've got a problem, we can track and see how they're doing with it. Fundamentally, I think what makes your struggle so hard right now is neither of those is entirely the case. I mean, Louise, it works with you with FibroScan, but you can't get people scanned more than once a year usually?
I think it depends. If you're in the NHS, you get a pre and post scan we used to do for viral hepatitis when they had their treatment so that we knew what was going on 12 weeks, 6 months and a year afterwards. So we were able to track that really, really nicely. But then I'm working in a specialised unit with a lot of FibroScans. If you're in the routine health, if you're in a NAFLD pathway, it's 3 to 5 years. Now, you can do an awful lot of damage to your liver in 6 months and less, as we've seen through COVID. And if you're doing a weight loss programme, you will want to be doing those FibroScans every month, 2 months, 3 months. Now, that sounds a lot, but that's actually so motivating to see people's internal change. That keeps them on that pathway. That's the trigger that keeps your weight down or your liver health improved because you can see a difference in weight loss and internal liver fat loss. You don't need huge amounts of weight sometimes to do that. You might need quality of diet. I've seen it recently massively on people who've just dropped sugar because that's, without dropping too much weight, they dropped their sugar, their internal fat came down. But I think it's totally different in the world where people do it themselves for their own wellness. And in some respects, that supports healthcare. That supports the health service. You're doing that and you're tracking it. And you're taking an active part in your own care and lifestyle. And that's where liver health may well sit for the majority of people, informed lifestyle decision making. You can go on a bender for a long time if you wanted to, with poor diet, poor alcohol consumption, and then bring it back. But you know what you're doing because you're monitoring it and you'll see it. As simple as scales sometimes. So there are benefits that I see by being able to access people who want to take part of that key role, which is why I talk about wellness a lot. Whilst I'm also there for the illness side, the ability to change the future liver health of a population and reduce healthcare needs in a lot of people who don't need it and a lot of people who only find out way too late. As I've said, I've spent the majority of my career, if not all of it, dealing with a condition that causes early death. and does not need to. And I think if I can alter one person's trajectory, then what I'm doing now is absolutely worth it.
So, Louise, as your valedictory pre-birthday comment, I think that one's fantastic. Okay, Tony, do you have a valedictory pre-Louise birthday comment you'd like to add?
Nothing that rivals what Louise just said. But what just keeps popping into my mind is that old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And I think the message is almost as simple as that. I mean, you can avoid a lot of problems if there's some focus on prevention. And I think that's the message we need to drive home.
So at the risk of sounding like the old baseball philosopher Yogi Berra, another way to put what Tony just said is you can avoid a lot of problems if you don't have them in the first place.
Too true.
Well, with that, Louise, happy birthday. Tony, thank you so much for your time. Bye-bye now.
And now, back to Roger.
We hope you've enjoyed this recording. If you have any comments or questions about the content of this conversation or the entire episode, please put them in the review section of the page from which you downloaded the conversation, or send an email to questions@surfingmash.com. It's not clear what we're going to be doing next week. We're looking at approaches featuring NITs and a separate one focusing some basic science. Either way, I'm sure it'll be fascinating, and I can't wait for us to put it out for you next week. Until then, stay safe, surf on. We'll see you on podcast. Bye-bye now.